morning, everyone. Welcome to our first Weglyn Endowed Chair of Multicultural Studies Symposium. Let's give a round of applause for us making it here on Thursday morning. Woo! All right. I want to start off by introducing our dean, Iris Levine, who has graciously accepted my invitation to come and give you a warm welcome. So please welcome Iris Levine.
Good morning, all. I am the Dean of the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences, and we in our college are very proud to house the Weglyn Endowed Chair of Multicultural Studies, an endowment that was created with the help of former President Bob Suzuki. Dr. Mary Danico serves as the director of the Weglyn Endowed Chair and has done a remarkable job of promoting the inspirational work of Mishi Weglyn, who passed away 20 years ago this year. Dr. Danico and her committee continue to honor the legacy and the work of Mishi Weglyn through the commitment to present events that highlight social justice issues. We have one of those today with the presence of the amazing Helen Zia. Thank you, Dr. Danico, and all who are involved in bringing these events to life. We have much work to do to make the world a better place, one that honors and acknowledges the many stories of our diverse history and provides hope for current and future generations. Looking forward to this today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Levine. This is such a wonderful program, and we have some fabulous faculty and staff members who are part of the Weglyn Endowed Advisory Committee. So I would just like you to just stand up and wave and do the royal wave really quickly, just to acknowledge. Yay, yes. Yes, Heidi. Thank you. So one of the things that we talked about as a committee is to launch our fall series, what would be kind of our dream team. And immediately what came to mind is the work of Phil Yu, Jeff Yang, and of course, Helen Zia. Phil and Jeff, as you know, they have a wonderful podcast, if you've seen it, called They Call Us Bruce. But on their own, they have done some incredible things. So this is Phil Yu, no relation, although we share the same last name. He has been an activist, influencer, and blogger of Angry Asian Man for 18 years. That's pretty incredible. He has been a consultant, executive producer for content that's related to film, entertainment, and politics. And he really is one of the nicest guy and rightfully angry, right? So I always joke, like, don't call him angry, just call him Phil, right? But I'm so thankful for his influence and his work in galvanizing coalitions and communities and being a wonderful person to speak for and with Asian Americans in general. So please welcome Phil. And then we have Jeff Yang. Jeff Yang has been a spokesperson for Asian America for as long as I've been around. I'm just kidding, not that long, but for a long time. He was one of the first to start an influential magazine called A Magazine that he started when he was a student at Harvard University. And he also is, he also is a active writer for The Post, for New York Times, has a column for San Francisco Chronicle, provides content, produces, and is a part of this team. But lately, he is better known as the father of Hudson Yang, the actor for Fresh Off the Boat. And so he wrote a really funny piece about now how he's Hudson's dad, as opposed to Jeff Yang. So please welcome Jeff. And finally, but definitely not last, is my shiro, Helen Zia. Helen, for many of you who may not know, gave up medical school and ended up in Detroit as a construction worker and a labor organizer and a vocal activist and leader because of what happened to Vincent Chin. And we're not talking about him today, but if you really should look at a wonderful documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin, where Helen is really profiled. She is a prolific author and one of the first Asian American, or I think the only Asian American woman that I know who is an editor of Ms. Magazine. And I think the title, Rad Femme equals Helen, is so fitting because she is totally rad, she's totally femme, and she will kick butt when needed. Uh, she has written multiple books, one of which most people cite in academia as Asian American Dreams. And she also wrote a book with Wen-Ho Lee. She has written a plethora of books, but I think the one that we're here to talk about today is The Last Boat Out of Shanghai. And this book inspired me to teach a class that many of you are in here on refugees and displaced communities because it's that powerful. I am so thrilled to invite our three esteemed guests to the stage, and you will be experiencing Cal Poly Pomona's first live podcast of They Call Us Bruce right now. So if I can invite all of you to come up, thank you.
Lovely.
And just as a plug, 50% of you have a chance of winning some amazing swag gear. I don't know if you saw the Stay Angry t-shirt by Angry Asian Man. It was on Always Be My Maybe. Randall Park wore it, so it became really, really popular. And also 25 copies of the book. And I have to say that this program would not be possible without the generous sponsorship of the California Endowment. And I do have to thank our friends here from the California Endowment who are in the front. If you can wave your hand in the air like you just don't care. And they also brought some incredible swag that you are welcome to partake in after the event. It's all in the front. So thank you so much, because this really could not have been done without the generous support of the California Endowment. So here we go.
Okay, before we get started, I think we should go into a little bit of the technical aspects of what's happening, just real quick. So Jeff and I host this podcast. They call us Bruce. It's going to be recorded. How are we looking, Nick? We're good. All right.
That's Nick's song, our intrepid young producer.
Yeah. Shout out to Nick. We will go through this our regular routine with the podcast. It's just going to be like we do normal, except we have this giant, awesome audience in front of us and this awesome guest. At some point, we're gonna during the podcast we'll do a little break. That's just we won't have an actual break here, but it's just a break for the podcast where we insert, messages and advertising, etc. You'll just roll with it. You'll understand. And then I think that's all the notes we got.
Well, they're actually so the second segment or half of our show is something that is sort of our signature. It's something we call the good, the bad, and the WTF. It's sort of like the round table segment of our podcast where we'll talk about a topic in three different directions. One topic.
You're gonna say this on the podcast.
I will say this on the podcast.
So don't say it right now. Yeah,
But the reason I'm saying this is just because that will happen after the break. Throughout the episode, please feel free to laugh, and if you feel like something is funny.
But don't laugh if it's not funny. I mean, just
laugh with us, not at us. But also just in general, react as you might. We won't be able to take questions during the actual recording, but then after that, I think we should have some time
we'll set aside some time.
Bring in some thoughts from the audience.
Post-recording.
Post-recording.
Okay.
All right, so that's pretty much it, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take us in. It's going to be awkward for a second, but you'll get it. Okay. We're good? All right. Hello and welcome to this very special live recording of They Call Us Bruce, an unfiltered conversation about what's happening in Asian America. We are live at Cal Poly Pomona. I'm Phil Yu.
And I'm Jeff Yang, Phil's co-host and partner in crime. Thank you. But we are incredibly, incredibly excited to be here on this stage with a long time and dear friend of ours, and somebody who's incredibly important, iconic, really, in our larger Asian American community, and that is journalist, author, activist, Helen Zia. That's where the applause comes in. And we're here to talk about a number of things, but very especially the most recent book of hers that she wrote and published, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution. But first, I think we want to get a little bit more context of, Helen, your own journey to get here, since this book is all about journeys, as it were. I mean, obviously, we've known you for a minute and respected you for even longer than that. But in the introduction to the introduction, before we started recording, our host, Mario Danico, mentioned that you actually gave up a potential career in medicine to become an author and journalist and activist. And then you were like, uh-huh.
First of all, Helen, welcome.
Yes, welcome.
Well, thank you. And I first just let me say, you are both, icons to me. I've known both of you and of your work for so many years, and everybody in the Asian American community who pays any attention at all to what's going on. I mean, you are the heroes, and what an honor it is for me to be here with you. So thank you.
Erect
And-
Asian humility wall now, boom.
Yeah. And also to be here at Cal Poly Pomona and be part of this program, and Mario Danico is really my shiro. So, and thanks to all of you for being here. So when the introduction said that I gave up medical school to become a construction worker, that's not quite, I quit medical school. It did not take a lot of persuasion to, and it was one of those things, as many of you can probably connect, as the daughter of immigrants. It was very hard for me to, after 2 weeks of being in medical school, I realized what a terrible mistake I had made. I did not major in anything science. I took the minimal, pre-med courses and unfortunately got accepted. But once I got accepted, it was, how do I tell my folks that this is not going to work? And it took me 2 years to get the courage up to just say, I'm not going back. And you can imagine how not happy that made them. But then when I went on to work in construction and get a job at Chrysler Corporation on a factory floor, they knew I had gone crazy. So anyway, that was a great way for me to then be able to pursue a life of activism, because they already thought their daughter was nuts. So it sort of didn't matter. And, coming out as a lesbian, it was also like, oh, okay, we knew she was crazy. And so anyway, they did come to accept all of that. So I can tell you, if you follow your heart and the passion of the things you really care about, to have your life and lead your life, not your parents' lives or what they wish for, ultimately, they'll come around.
I think I can speak for the other people who've disappointed their parents on this stage that is absolutely true, guys. Go forward and follow your dreams.
Yeah. To continue the sort of the praise and adoration on both sides of the stage, I mean this when I say that, Helen, you are one of my greatest inspirations as an Asian American activist and writer, and someone who just raises my voice. You know what I mean? I think like a lot of people of my generation, we came to know of you and your work through the Vincent Chin case. For me, it was seeing the documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin, and just seeing your face, just seeing you raise your voice and being so prominent and being a figure in that movement. Learning about the case, watching that movie, learning about the case, and learning about you, it changed my life. It honestly was a benchmark in me understanding what my identity as Asian American was, who I could be, what I should stand up for. It articulated a lot of the struggles I had as I had never been through something like that, but it articulated so much of the sentiment that I felt throughout my life. I've told you this before, we've been on other panels together before, but like honestly, being here with you and talking with you and sharing like this is an honor to me, because you have informed so much of my journey along the way,
Well, thank you for that, and thank you both. I mean, this is a love fest, by the way, if you haven't noticed. But, I feel like everything I've done has been part of breaking through the invisibility that we still have, as especially those of us who are Asian American or Pacific Islander in this country. And both of you, through Angry Asian Man, through A Magazine, through all of the writings and speaking that both of you do, I mean, that's really what it's about. It's to bring our voices to the fore. And, I feel like that's what my work has been about, too.
Well, let's talk about that work, and very specifically, I think the books that you have written, and this one in particular. so many of them have been anchored in the context of immigration, right? Of going from far off shores and arriving to even more distant ones, places which are not home, which are alien, and which ultimately you make home. And even the story, the initial kind of serving as a spokesperson in the context of Vincent Chin was also about raising a voice of an immigrant who was not able to speak for himself, for a family who was not able to speak for themselves, and a community ultimately who could not. So how did you actually gravitate towards exploring in all of the works you've done that particular kind of almost liminal marginalization, being between two worlds and maybe party to neither?
Well, for me, the part is, what do you choose to write about? And, they always say, talk about what you know. Well, I also know that what I know, so much of this country has no idea. I mean, when the Vincent Chin case started out and I was a budding journalist and I became the spokesperson for the group, every time we met with a reporter, it was doing Asian Americans 101. No, we didn't all just come fresh off the boat, though some of us may have. There are the railroads, hello. Asian Americans have actually been on this continent going back to recorded to the 1500s, and to have to actually explain that over and over again. And so it just has become a consistent theme for me, in a way, to find the places that people are, the stories that are missing. And when I did Asian American Dreams, I actually came up with the phrase, instead of MIA, missing in action, MIH, missing in history, which I feel that, so many people, Asian Americans and beyond, in this society are MIH, missing in history. And so there's a piece of that history that I can share, that I have a passion for exploration. And so this book is, in a way, a continuation of that. An exodus that is not only missing here, missing in China, missing in the world. There's not another book in the English language, not a PhD dissertation, not a master's thesis about this migration. And this migration is 70 years old. And I think we can point to any of our communities and say, wow, I never see anything about this part of my story, my family's story. And so, I think that's something every one of us can do. And I feel like that's what both of you do, bringing those stories to the fore.
You are your family of Chinese immigrants. What is your personal connection to this specific story, though? What was it that drew you to this? Like a lot of us, for me, reading it, I realized that I too knew nothing. Like my history had failed me. My history education had failed me. But what was your entryway into sort of wanting to dive so deeply into this story?
Well, so I was completely ignorant about this, even though my family's story was part of this. And the phrase "last boat out of Shanghai" is not something I created. It's something I grew up hearing. And that was the only thing I knew about my family's story, that my aunt would say, "Oh, we came on the last boat out of Shanghai." And she would say it like that. And as a kid, you never know what that means. And as I got older, I met more and more people who said, "We came on the last boat out of Shanghai." And then you realize, wow, there's no boat in the world large enough to hold all those people, or they'd say the last plane out of Shanghai, the last train out of Shanghai, and it's the same thing. But the one thing that was in common was they all had that sense that the last boat before imminent disaster or doom. And so I wondered what that was. And then at a certain point, I heard a story from my mother, and she had never shared, I would say to her, "Mom, what was it like growing up in China and as a kid?" And she would say, "That was wartime, a bad memory." And one of the things, that's a thread with my other work is that even today, with all the anti-immigrant, anti-immigration assaults that are happening every day, Asian Americans are never included in that discussion, even though Asian Americans have the highest proportion of immigrants of any community in this country. And that invisibility, so part of my feeling was, well, I want to tell part of that story. And so this is a 70-year-old migration. You know, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Communist Revolution in the mainland of China, and nobody knows this, even in China. And so, so I felt like this was something I wanted to tell. I had a personal connection to it, but it also opened up a whole door to something I didn't know. And I think that's something that, you know, actually every one of our communities could be doing.
You know, the phrase that you mentioned a little earlier, one that's, of course, very familiar to myself as well, fresh off the boat, right? That term is often used with, as either self-deprecatory description of people who are more recently immigrated, or as an insult thrown at people who are more recent immigrants. And the thing that it hides is what the boat that people have gotten off of looks like, what the journey looked like, right, in arriving. You know, we discussed a little bit before the event started about the fact that you know, migration is a very complicated topic here in America, not least because, you know, there tends to be a conflation of a lot of different experiences. You know, there are extremely involuntary migrations, such as slavery, you know, African Americans being kidnapped and brought here, and then there are some which have various levels of agency associated with it. But in almost every case, the story of migration is kind of a harrowing one. And this one, this last boat out of Shanghai, the description you give to it, even in the very prologue, is just amazing. It's about people not realizing they're never going to see potentially their family members, the city they grew up in again, trying to get out on a boat that is so overloaded that it's almost sinking, through a port, down a river, essentially, that is full of purposely wrecked ships that were put down there to prevent incoming invaders from being able to get access to the city, and which were subsequently mined by those invaders. So it was a deadly experience for some. You mentioned that there were boats that didn't get out, right?
Right. The worst maritime disasters even double the deaths that the Titanic had. I mean, the worst maritime disasters were of this period.
And again, those are stories that are lost in history, that are missing from our history. So the whole notion, though, of people escaping this, I remember you noting that there was some resistance to you telling the story because there was a perception that the people who were escaping during this period were wealthy and you know, why talk about them? Of course, they had the resources to get out. What was the context of that, and how did you kind of overcome some of those thoughts, even in your own decision to take on this story?
Well, you know, as you were saying, so much is conflated, you know, that actually to many people, all Asian Americans are the same, and as people who are, whose roots go to Asia, nobody in Asia calls themselves an Asian, right? There's no such thing in Asia of an Asian. And, you know, if we take any one of the nations or countries that are, you know, have their political borders and so forth, and have, you know, 1.5 billion or whatever in China, there's so much differentiation and cultural differences. And within the Chinese context, people who are from Shanghai are probably the least popular of any of the Chinese language groups or ethnicities. Because why? Because Shanghai was the most modern city, educated, all this stuff, westernized, and it was a group of people that didn't mind bragging about that. And so wherever the Shanghainese went, including Hong Kong or Taiwan or the United States, they would tend to brag about things. And one of the things I found was, you know, the oldest Chinese American community is from southern China, from Guangzhou province. And the difference between the Cantonese and the Shanghainese was described to me like this. A Shanghainese with $1 acts like they have $100. You know, a Cantonese who has $100 acts like they have $1. And you can imagine just that was oil and water. And so in a lot of settings, including academia, people who study Asian American and Chinese American history, you know, it's like the Shanghainese, who cares? They brag so much about themselves, why do we need to have to study them? And so I think that was some of the resistance, but in a way that made it appealing in the sense that I felt like I could unpack a lot of that, blow up some of the stereotypes that even among, Chinese Americans ourselves that we have of the different, the different groups of Chinese Americans, let alone Asian Americans. So I think a lot of that is, we have to educate ourselves. We have to own our own prejudices to other people, even internally, and all this stuff. And the more we know, the more we share, the better, the more informed all of us will be, including people who have, who say, oh, you're all alike, aren't you? And you can say, no, actually, we're very different, So that's what.
Can you talk a little bit about let's talk about process, because I would like to know, if you read this, the scope and the level of detail with which you write, and all in addition to being a historical epic, it also is extremely cinematic in its narrative. The way you write with sort of the interior of these characters, these real characters. How did you go about gathering all of this, just history and personal detail, and it's kind of to me it seemed very daunting when I was reading it. So how did you start?
So the process was a long one, and I didn't begin with a narrative or an idea of how to go about it. I also didn't know that many people who were survivors or who had gone on this journey. So part of it was having to find them. But I have to say, I started this book more than 12 years ago. And so it was a 12-year journey, and I realized some of you were in elementary school at that point, and I had no idea it was going to take me this long. But part of it was in order to get the emotion. When people leave, and the vast majority of Americans' ancestry is somewhere else, whether they were forcibly, kidnapped to come here or came, quote, voluntarily. But the point is, nobody leaves where they are if they're doing great where they are. And that applies to the Pilgrims. They didn't leave, Europe because they were doing well there. They left because they couldn't survive there and they had to leave. And that is true for this migration. It's true for really every migration. If you're doing great, you don't leave. And that process of migrating is traumatic. It's really a trauma, and most people don't talk about it. They don't tell their kids. They don't want their kids to know there was a time when they went through a really hard time emotionally. And so when I found these people, I also wanted to get some idea of, and so what was that like growing up in a war-torn city where you could walk to school as a child and there would be dead bodies along the way, and you were told as a 5-year-old, if you see a dead body, walk around it or go the other way. What was that like? And a lot of people, it's hard to get to that level of how did you feel then? And so the main characters, the real people that I interviewed, and it's their real names, it's their real stories, I interviewed them over a period of more than 10 years. Several of them, I'd talked to like 12 times or so. And they wouldn't talk about, the most painful things the first 5 years I talked to them. But maybe by year 10, I could ask, one of the main people, Benny, what was it like when your father was in prison? What was it like knowing that he was probably going to get executed for being a traitor to China? How did that make you feel? And by year 7, I could ask him, and how did you feel about your father? And he could finally say to me, he was my father. I loved my father, but I hated him too. I hated the decisions he made that destroyed our family, and I hated what he did to the Chinese people. And so that was part of it, to really dig down into their descriptions. And I have to say, so many of these people were just so generous with me because they let me call them time and time again and just say, well, you said this, and what was that like for you? And could you describe it more? And I didn't quite understand, what was that dynamic between you and your mother? And you can figure if somebody started asking you about, major times in your lives, the first time you described it, you might just, give a thumbnail sketch. And then if person keeps bugging you and asking more and more, you might get in touch with the feelings you had when you were 10 years old, and then to share that.
It sort of reminds me that writing is like therapy, right? I mean, not just for yourself, but often for others. It gives people an opportunity to even tell stories that they didn't know that they had within them. And I think that especially when you're talking about stories of migration, stories of loss, stories of displacement, as you pointed out, these are stories that you suppress purposely. Others often repress them in you. They say, don't talk about these things. You ultimately choose to push them down deep because you have to remake yourself whenever you come somewhere else. And a lot of that, I think, speaks to the very kind of amazingly contemporary feel of the book. That even though this book is about a certain time, a certain place, a certain conflict, and a certain class of people, there are some universal aspects to migration that we are seeing that are intensely relevant to today and to other migrations, including ones across our southern border. And I wanted to pull that forward a little bit because here we are in California. We're watching a lot of this stuff play out on our main stage, as it were. As you were writing this book, and even as you were kind of capturing these stories, were you aware of how relevant this notion of migration was going to be when the book actually was published? And once it was, how did you start thinking of putting closure on the work and layering some of the things you actually say in the book that brings that connection forward?
Well, starting a book 12 years ago, honestly, it was really stories that I wanted to uncover. I mean, as you say, there's a process, of revelation, too. And so I didn't know where the story was going to go. I just knew that there was stuff there that I couldn't find anything about it. I knew there was a lot to discover. And as I started interviewing people and asking them, so how did your family decide to leave? And they would tell me, I mean, some of these debates would go on for 2 years within their family. Should we leave? Should we stay? A revolution is coming. What will happen to us? What will happen to the children? And they were children at this time. If we leave, where will we go? Where we go, how will we live? Will we survive if we stay? If we leave, will we survive? And all of those kind of things. And if you can't afford to bring the whole family, who do you leave behind? These were all things, we're going to leave everything we own. How can we do that? What can we carry in the 2 bags that we're bringing? And this is a story of every, refugee community. It's a story of every really migrant community. You can't bring like a container ship with you, and you can't bring the entire family, all of the cousins, aunts, and uncles, grandparents. And so there were so many stories of people who left babies behind and never got to see them again, families that were torn apart. And whether it was the last boat out of Shanghai or the last helicopter out of Saigon or the last rubber raft onto the Mediterranean with families who can't swim and they're putting their own babies on a raft, not knowing whether they're going to survive, or the last bus leaving, Guatemala, and then you have to get off the bus and walk 1,000 miles with your baby on your back, not knowing whether the baby is going to be ripped away from you and put in a chain link cage on a cement floor. Why do people do that? They think about it very hard before they do it, and they only do it because they think if we stay, the children are not going to live past childhood. And so that was something that I learned about all of these people as I interviewed them, and it was just clear as we've made our way to today, that this was something that, with all of the, and pardon me, all the bullshit we hear all the time, emanating from people who just label all of refugees around the world as criminals, as people who are, just decided yesterday, let's go on the rubber raft and go destroy whatever country that they end up in. That's not the case. They went through all of the agony to do this, and as I was saying, nobody leaves their country, their home, their family, everything they know and love. Nobody leaves unless they feel like they have to, and so that's where I ended up with this book as I was finishing writing it.
The book. So much of the book is I would categorize in the genre that I I can't like I devour, but I'm always like it hurts my heart to read. Is the genre that I would categorize as sad stories of Asian cruelty. Just learning about, so much of, the suffering that happens in our motherland, and to read about these characters and the unimaginable calculation that has to go into these decisions they have to make, especially when I hear about stories of children in peril and these decisions that parents have to make to, just even in some of the characters in your book where children were just given up because it was the best for the family. When I read about that and then today in contemporary stories of these unimaginable sacrifices that families have to make, I don't understand sort of the criticism and the scapegoating that happens. Like, why would anyone voluntarily do this to themselves? Knowing this, they did because they had no choice.
Right.
It's that immense suffering that has to happen, even in just the decisions. And so I wonder if, but I feel like this is not something I usually hear about, sort of things happening in my own community. Like, again, sort of the stories that like we that come to the forefront that the media sort of propels. Like, I never get to hear about this sort of on the level of like, it's always in the level of shaping a boogeyman, of shaping like a the thing that we have to beware of. I have no question. That's just me sort of venting and
Well,
getting
and
emotional.
and my hope, I think, as a writer, is that if we can learn a little bit about history, and ask ourselves, what would it take for you to leave your family today, to maybe leave behind children, and take only, who would you take? Leave behind your mother and father, the people you love. What would it take? And then to put yourself, in that in those shoes, and then to learn a little bit about history of what these people went through. How would you, make that decision? And then to be able to say, you know what, there are 73 million refugees around the world today. Every one of them have experienced that trauma. And so what are we inflicting on them today with this government that we have? The walls, not only physical walls, but bureaucratic walls about changes that are happening to make it impossible for immigrants to live here, to get medical care or food stamps for their kids. This is what's happening today. And so the kind of, if we can learn from history, I hope we can stop repeating it. But I do want to say that in the book, it's not all doom and gloom either.
Yes.
There are stories about what people discover in having to find a home in a new place. And what does that mean? The 4 young people that I follow through their exodus years and then their diaspora, I mean, they find love, they find homes, they make a new life. It's not easy, but they do it. And that is also the story of every migrant around the world, too, that they try to find a way to survive, some more successfully than others, but that is also part of their journey. And for Asian American Pacific Islander people, that is very much a part of the journey, because so many of our community are either immigrants ourselves or from families that are very recent immigrants. So we know this story very well. But I just want to say there are happy moments too. So.
Is there something that you wanted to share with us?
Well, I did want to share one of those moments. It's very brief. This is one of the people who actually found himself on a ship leaving Shanghai, and he was a student, and so he kept a journal. He kept a journal of his first day leaving, and I got the journal. He gave it to me. I had it translated, and so here is just one note from him. The American ship offered Ho a first glimpse into his upcoming life in America. To cool off from the heat of a sticky August day, he took a shower. his first experience with such a contraption. Nearby was the water fountain, another first. After a few cautious sips, he quenched his thirst from this amazing device that dispensed a continuous stream of clean water, no boiling necessary. In the third-class dining room, he waited in a long but orderly line for servings of sausages, potatoes, carrots, rice, bread, fruits, tea, and sugar, a precious commodity in Shanghai. The unlimited quantities stunned him, especially the sugar. That night, he jotted down a new American phrase, all you can eat. And for most migrants from around the world, they come to America. That is what all you can eat? Are you kidding? And so this was I've heard this actually over and over again from so many of the people that I've not only interviewed, but who have come from all over the world. America, all you can eat, clean water, and so those are also the kind of things that I discovered.
Can I say that this is at the very root, I think, of Chinese immigrants, certainly, fascination with, like, buffets. My own family, there are, of course, Chinese buffets, but even when we go to, like, Atlantic City or Las Vegas or something, one of the first things they want to do is say, oh, let's check out the buffet, because for them, it is the very heart, the very symbol of American abundance, almost disgusting abundance.
Well,
right?
and so is the Ziploc bag that you can carry with you to every buffet. So.
There's no genre of there's no Asian cuisine, honestly, right? But there is a legit thing as Asian buffet, and
Yeah.
I'll argue that to the end. All you can eat Asian buffet. On that note, this is a good time for us to take a break. But when we return, we will do our signature segment: the good, the bad, and the WTF. So please stick around. Let's take a break. Okay.
All right.
And
So-
now we'll return from the break.
Exactly. Good break, guys.
Quick break.
Yeah.
So we'll just come in and we'll just do.
Yeah.
You'll lay down the rules.
I'll lay down the
okay.
rules.
And we're back. All right. On this second half of They Call Us Bruce, we will do our signature segment: the good, the bad, and the WTF. Jeff Yang, would you please lay down the rules of engagement?
That I will do. So this is our roundtable segment of the show, in which we and our esteemed guests will cover a topic from three different directions. Those three directions being, of course, the good, the thing that makes us feel positive, warm, fuzzy, excited, it's inspired perhaps about that topic. And then the bad, the thing that troubles us, pisses us off maybe a little bit. And then finally, the WTF. And just to be clear, the WTF is not necessarily a bad thing. It simply means the questions we still have, the things that still make us go, the puzzles that are still left to be unpuzzled. And for this particular conversation, we wanted to look at the good, the bad, and the WTF of something which I think is at the heart of, again, not just this book, but the larger conversation that you've been leading and taking a part of, and that's migration, right? Both voluntary and less voluntary, or very involuntary, as the case may be. Those sort of universal tropes that extend around what, again, it means to cross borders and cross oceans in search of either freedom, security, aspiration, or simply safety for your children. And we always put our guests in the hot seat first. So, Helen, let's start with the good of migration. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of there are goods, right? So, what would you say, especially in the course of writing this book, you felt was your biggest good takeaway, perhaps, from migration?
Well, I was going to start with the bad, but let me just say that, given all of the bad that's going on about what's said about immigrants and how terrible they are, and refugees, and why they should all be deported, even if they're here, quote, legally, and have legal papers and should be driven away, the good is that immigrants make America strong. Immigrants make America stronger. And that has been part of this country's heritage that actually every president before this one has acknowledged and welcomed And there's study after study after study that shows this, and actually I'm involved right now with a movement that's going on called the One Nation Commission to show that immigrants make America strong. And so anyway, that I think is not only good, it's the foundation of this country. It's what attracts so many immigrants, migrants, refugees here. You know, for this group, it was the place of first choice. It was also the hardest place to get to, which I think is also part of the story. But I think that's the good, and we have to repeat it over and over and over again, and so that's the good.
It's great. I'll jump in here, and I will say one of the things that really struck me about how the book closes is you talk about where the Shanghainese immigrants or migrants landed. A lot of them ended up in New York. A lot of them ended up in situations very different from where they came. They lost money, they lost everything. They chose, quote unquote, to do things like work in garment factories. Oh, just for fun, right? I remember there was an anecdote about that when and they opened restaurants and they did other things that were about again finding a new way to just build a foundation in this new place, a place that didn't necessarily want them there. And then you have this litany of just startlingly successful people who came out of families who migrated because of this Shanghai, sort of escape, as it were. And it's an incredible list. So to me, I think part of the good, and I think this extends to migration in general, but refugees perhaps in particular, is that rather than seeing people who flee and go through immense turmoil to get to a place like this as somehow being the refuse of those countries, no, those are the people who have forged themselves into survivors, into people who can kind of take anything, who've become diamonds in the process of the pressure. We want more of those people, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it takes incredible planning, first of all. If you know you're going to have to walk 1,000 miles with your babies, what do you bring? And where are you going to go? And what is the route that's going to be the safest? I mean, this is what these people, this generation of migrants went through. That's what everyone goes through. It's not like, oh, magically be transported here. And so, so these are people who, are willing to take risks. They're trying to survive. They make incredible plans, and they end up in a country, and many of them came with a lot of maybe not financial capital, but they came with intellectual capital, they came with social capital, they knew how to do things, and were willing to set up somewhere else. And the investment, of the bad today, is how even people are being, told that you can't get food stamps, you can't get medical care for your sick child or your aging parent, or housing assistance if you're a refugee who ends up here with nothing. And to not think what an investment that is, too, because really, the next generation, you're talking about who some of these people are from this one diaspora. That includes Maya Lin, Amy Tan, Nobel Prize winner Stephen Chu, who was Secretary of Energy, current Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chao. It includes just an enormous array of talented people. And that's
I made a face, sorry.
And I want to say, people might think, oh, well, they're Asian, and so that's the model minority thing. No, it's the fact that they are the children of immigrants, which also include General Colin Powell, Carlos Santana, Edwidge Danticat, and you could go through a whole list of people from Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, who, as the children of immigrants and refugees, are the ones who saw the sacrifices that their parents made and want to pay it forward. And so that's one of the other, the lesson from here. It's not only immigrants make America stronger, it's the children and who also really want to make a contribution for the safety that their families got.
Is it my turn?
Your turn for the good.
The good. Mine would be that for anybody who picks up their entire lives and goes somewhere completely different and plants roots there, it's where you get, it's really extraordinary where you really get to see the definitions of community that happen. Even more so than at our respective points of origin, I think, where you really get to see where people find one another, help one another, and you know, whether it's you know, a Chinese American, whether it's Chinatowns or finding community in a church, or my parents found, you know, a Korean American church. You really get to see the support systems and the way people really find one another. I was telling Helen before we started, you know, my last year was the 45th anniversary of my mom first arriving in America as a nurse in the 70s. She didn't know anybody when she came. I mean, she knew a handful of people from nursing school, but with those handful of people, she you know, created a community, and you know, and you, from there it kind of branches out, and the roots become a little stronger. But you really see that resilience and that dependence on each other, and then it lays the groundwork for what we call the Asian American community today. You know.
We have concluded round one, the good. We want to talk about the bad now, and I think what we'll do is I'll throw out a bad, and then you can do your bad, and then we'll have you do your bad, and then we'll do one last round, which is a WTF, and we'll end on you. So the bad of migration. I mean, you know, this is less than bad of migration itself, and more about how it is thought of or considered. I mean, on the one hand, yes, there's no question that the American dream and this notion of immigration as an aspirational thing for this country is at the very heart of a lot of why this country has been successful. You know, I do think, though, sometimes that when we talk about migration, we have to remember that nobody migrates somewhere where there weren't people already, right? And you know, there is sometimes a little bit of an erasure of some of the other ways that people have arrived here or have been here all along, right? So, you know, as we talk as immigrants, sometimes I think, well, look, we have to acknowledge that the successes that we have, the ability we have to build came, A, because, you know, there was an entire people who were brought here involuntarily who rose up and resisted and were able to actually create rights for us so that we could land here, so we could make this possible. And even before that, there were people who were here already. And without, you know, the suffering of, this country wouldn't even exist, right? Without the genocide of, this country wouldn't exist. And, you know, so those are things which I think kind of buffer the larger context of what migration looks like. I do think that that's one of the big tensions when we talk about as immigrants and the children of immigrants, that we don't always reach back and find those common ground points and those areas of coalition. And I think that's particularly painful now, because so much of the sort of more recent activation of Asian Americans, and immigrant Asian Americans especially, has been around things like affirmative action, where, you know, it's been about backlash towards people who did make those sacrifices because people are trying to see, you know, the fruition of what they see as their American dream. I mean, sorry, that's a little heavy, but we're in the bad phase, so that's where we go.
Okay. The bad for me, the bad. I'm gonna. The short answer is racism. Look, this is where I was born, and this is home. This is where my parents ended up, and this is where I was born. And who knows where the tides of history will take me? But for all I know, I'm here for good, and this is where I'm staying. Right. What I've come to understand, and slowly accept as a reality, that I will not be fully accepted by everyone as belonging here. It's just with this face and this body and who I am, like, there will be people perpetually, and my kids and so on, who will always see us as invaders, as foreigners in some fashion. And as much as I would like to see, like, we all dream of a day where, like, oh, things will get better and we'll all be accepted. It's like, I've come to realize that not in my lifetime, and not down the line. It's like, I will not be fully accepted by everyone, and I just have to realize it's like, well, and then that's why we fight, you know. And but I realize like that fight will never end till I die, you know. Like this is who I am. I'm here to stay, but it's a perpetual lifetime of just of fighting to prove that, you know.
Wow. Both of you said really bad things. I agree. Those are really bad, and that they are part of the reality. And that, you know, every new crop or wave of migrants who reach here are coming here to survive. They are leaving something behind. They don't know what they're arriving to, except that no matter where migrants go anywhere in the world, they won't be welcome. So we're talking about trauma after trauma after trauma that's inflicted on people, and that creates all kinds of mental health issues. I mean, I feel like this whole generation of this migration and every other one suffers from PTSD, you know, that didn't have a name and doesn't get acknowledged or treated, and under the current rules of denying health care to people, it's also creating, you know, people who know they need health care and mental health assistance are not going to get it. And so what are we doing but re-traumatizing a whole group? And the feeling that we will never be accepted is also part of that trauma. And I would just like to switch to a little bit of good, though. I have to say that I don't feel quite as strongly that we will never be accepted, because I feel like, you know, the genie can't go back in the bottle. The immigrants are here. You know, the 41 million that are here already are not going to go back anywhere. And so we are Americans too. And, you know, right? And within the lifetimes of, you know, all of you who are students here, your children, the whole demographics of this country is changing, and that's one reason all this stuff about make America white again. Oh, is it great again? I forget. But, you know, why the white supremacy house is insisting on all of this stuff is because they think to hark back to another day that cannot be. And so the whole demography is going to change. It's going to look a lot more like this room, and because of that, it will change if we make it change. You're right, it's not going to happen on its own, but that's why every one of us who has stories to tell should be telling these stories and making sure that this whole master narrative about, you know, the Pilgrims and all that stuff, you know, that they weren't alone, the Pilgrims, and there were many other people of different colors and backgrounds who came too, and that should be part of the narrative, and that's what's going to make it change. So anyway, it's bad, but I think it's not that bad.
There's good in every bad and bad in every good in many ways. But now we're at the WTF stage of our game, and I'd like to invite Phil, you to begin, and give us that W to the F.
Mine's something I was thinking about. So mine is about what we leave behind, what is left behind, and what is retained within ourselves when, you know, we and our families make the journey over here. I think about this because my parents immigrated to the United States from Korea in the 1970s. I was just in Korea over the weekend, actually, a quick trip to Korea for a friend's wedding, but you know, everyone always talks about how modern Korea is, but my parents are stuck in the 70s, right? They are in the 1970s. I don't know if they're stuck, but like so much of what they retained was what they left of the Korea of that era. You know what I mean? And you know, the country has changed vastly since they've been gone. In the 40 years they've been gone, I always consider my parents old school, but like in a lot of ways, like they are really old school in that. The old school, like the old school went new school without them, and then they stayed there, frozen in time. I think that's just an interesting thing, you know. And then, if ever they entertain the thought of like going back, as a lot of people tell us to go back, right? They could never go back because where they came from is not there anymore, you know. Right. So it's such a strange thing to think about. We always talk about our motherlands and the old country and everything, but the old country changed too. So what we leave behind is not there anymore. It's gone.
Yeah, and I'm actually going to compliment that because this is, I think, a very classic, a classic impact on people who are especially children of immigrants, I think, which has its own, I think, mental health contexts, right? That just as the world that our parents may have left changed, dramatically in their absence, we, brought up adjacent to immigration, and sometimes with like little sips of the culture that our parents came from, often do not feel as if we truly have those roots and understanding of where they came from, the stories they have, in part because they don't want to tell those stories, right? My parents did not have a particularly traumatic migration. They came in 1965, they were educated, they came for graduate school and things like that. But even so, they don't want to talk about the early days of struggle. They don't want to talk about the relatives who did not actually manage to come out here that they're still supporting. And yet they do want me to go and rediscover those things. And of course, when I've gone back there, much like, your weekend trip to Korea, man, whatever, we also find ourselves displaced. Not so much because the culture has changed, but because it never was ours to begin with, not fully. And that sense of being neither here nor there, I think it so deeply permeates, especially second-generation Asian Americanness, second-generation immigrantness, right? That it virtually defines the way we speak, the way we think, the way we engage with other people, the code switching that we have to do even just to maintain our sense of identity, and of course the way we write. And so much of that, I feel, in this book in particular, is present. That sense of like discovering yourself by discovering these other stories. So that's a little bit of a WTF. It's not necessarily a bad WTF, although it can be. And now I'm going to invite you, Helen, to play cleanup and bring us home with your WTF.
Close it out, Helen.
Close it out.
Well, I feel like every day I say WTF, except I don't use the initials. And even waking up today is sort of like, what the F, And so anyway.
What a year this week has been, yes.
Well, I just want to say it's the Watergate time all over again. And so, as somebody who writes history, when you're in it, you don't see it. This is a 70-year-old migration. We are going through such an incredible historic time. Historians will write about this time of history that is your time of history as a most shameful period and what the fuck of what's happening today, really. I guess you have to bleep me out, but...
no, we will not.
No. Fuck.
But to your point about, culture and so forth, if we take a longer historic view about that, for Japanese American migration, there was quite a large migration that happened at the turn of the 20th century. So now there are tourists from Japan that go to Hawaii to see how the quaint Japanese Americans practice cultural things that they don't do in Japan and haven't done in 100 years. So it's like going to see the Pennsylvania Dutch, except what they're going to see is like, oh, look, these people who are Japanese American do something that we don't in Japan do, and haven't done in 100 years. And in a way, that's part of the responsibility, I think, for those of us who are second generation, third, fourth, fifth, 10th generation Asian American here, to be able to, educate and talk with the newer immigrants, migrants, refugees who have no idea what it means to be part of a society that has a much longer history than what they're familiar with. And so, I just think for everyone in this room, that's part of what we have to do. And if somebody would do that to the new immigrant in the White House and understand what that migration means, maybe, but I'm not hopeful, that would, WTF, some change there. But looking to the future that all of we are part of, that's what it's going to take. Every one of us reclaiming our history, our why we belong here, why our stories are every one of our stories are American stories, and why they should be taught and learned and absorbed and valued as part of American stories too. That's what it's going to take. And WTF, we should be doing that,
Right on.
everybody.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
So So years from now, when you remember this day in history, remember you all spent this day with us. They call us Bruce and Helen Zia. Helen, thank you so much for being on They Call Us Bruce.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah.
Helen, where can people find you online, social media-wise?
Oh, social media, you know, I'm old school, so it's really hard for me to do social media. People find me on Facebook, and I don't even know how to answer, or Insta. Now I know that's a word, you know. But I have a website, helenzia.com. That's easy to remember. And the latest activity around creating a movement around immigrants is onenationaapi dot either com or org, sorry. I told you I'm not good at this. But One Nation AAPI, you can find some of the actions you can be part of to make a change here.
And Jeff Yang, where can people find you?
On Twitter and pretty much everywhere else, I am Original Spin. And you, Phil, where can people find Phil you?
You can find me at Angry Asian Man and on angryasianman.com. Well, that does it for this very special live episode of They Call Us Bruce. We want to thank Cal Poly Pomona. We want to thank Mary Udanico for all your help and everything. We want to thank everybody here who came out. Thank you so much. You can find us online at They Call Us Bruce on all the social media. But if you hop on Apple Podcasts and give us a rating or review, that would be really helpful as well. Thanks so much. Until next time, peace.
Peace.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Phil. This was amazing.
OMG. Can we give him another round of applause? I'm not sure if this is working. Is this working? Okay. So I know folks have to go to class at 1, but I do want to invite all of you who are able to stay. We do have lunch. But even more important than that, Yvonne's going to come in, and we do have raffle winners. So I don't know if you know that 25 of you will have a copy of Helen Zia's book that she has autographed this morning. So we'll be able to give that to you, especially for those who have to leave. For those of you who already have her book, you're welcome to have her sign your book for her, because there are about 20 of you who have that or more. And then we have 20 winners who have won the Angry Asian Man t-shirt as well. Woo! So, woo! And all of this is in generosity of the California Endowment, so I just want to thank them. Phil's t-shirts are also for sale. So he brought sizes of different kind, as well as Helen's book is also for sale. If you did not win, but you want to read it, please go ahead and feel free to purchase like 5 or 10 of each. That would be great, and share it and give it as holiday gifts. You know, those are always nice, birthday gifts, but please feel to do that. I do want to see if for 5 minutes, if we may have any folks who may have questions.
Yeah.
And then I want to invite folks to have lunch and then have more intimate conversations. This room is small. We couldn't get the other room, so we're going to have to move the seats around when we get the food, so you can just reconfigure spaces and eat together and build a community. And if you want to stay up there and we can gather around you, that we can do that too, because you're the only ones at the table up front.
How do people know that they won?
Oh, I'm going to get Yvonne after the Q&A, and we're going to put the names up. Yeah, so Yvonne is here. So who has a question? And while you're asking questions, Yvonne's going to put
There's
down who won.
a microphone up here,
Yeah.
too.
Anthony.
Hey, I'm Anthony, and I just want to thank you for, speaking to all sorts of topics related to Asian Americanness, how identity has evolved. And my question had to do with, since all of you have had a sense of the landscape of Asian American identity across time, I was wondering how you thought the community has evolved on issues of inclusivity with respect to South Asians, Southeast Asians, with respect to queerness, with respect to undocumented Asians. I'm wondering what you find is the trick to ensuring that Asian Americans open gates as opposed to close gates to marginal members of the community.
I personally feel like we have not done a great job, and we need to do a better job along all of those dimensions. One of the things I think about telling the stories we tell ourselves is that often they elude the nuances and intersections that I think make those stories universal, right? that is, Helen, you had to pick 4 stories out of many, right, coming out of the history of this moment. That element of curation is something that we inevitably have to do because a book can only be like, what, 400 pages,
This
right?
stretched the boundaries of
Yeah.
how much I could put in. Yeah.
But in the larger conversation around them, we have to find ways to draw connections with those communities, not only that are outside of our own, but within our own, who are not represented in the way that we're able to tell them. And I do think things like, inclusion across the different kinds of migration we talked about, South Asian, Southeast Asian, even, again, Pacific Islander, and the very different migrations that occurred in their history, those are things that we need to actually carry forward as we tell these stories. And then within, I think we do have to acknowledge, there are people who made it out, my own parents among them, who are educated, who had a certain amount of human capital coming out. The stories in this book also, are of people who generally have that advantage. But then there are people who are leaving with very little, in part perhaps because in their own societies they were shunned or marginalized. Queer people, transgender people, et cetera. And I think that those are some of the stories that, coming forward, I want to see privileged in our storytelling.
Yeah, I just want to, in addition to what Jeff just said, is we're, coming from a disadvantage. In other words, because they're, when you're completely invisible, pretty much, as they said with Crazy Rich Asians, and how many are really crazy rich, right? The first, Hollywood movie in 20 years. Well, all of the, pretty much the new migrants who arrive from anywhere, including Asia and the Pacific, they're drinking that poison too. That's how everybody learns about, who those other people are, including ourselves, including Asian Americans. And so the lack of knowledge is huge. And so part of it is you have to come out of invisibility and tell more stories. The more, the better. Even if they're stories of people I don't agree with. The ones who are anti-affirmative action or new immigrants who feel no other immigrants should be able to come. We know that, or the anti-LGBT, anti-marriage equality churches that abound in our Asian American communities. I mean, I may disagree with that, but I support their right to tell their story. I want to see more of all stories there. And the more that American society and the world in general can know that, that there isn't just one story and one narrative, it really there's a lot. Just as, the so-called white Americans are all labeled under this one, whiteness, what is that? How many countries and cultures in Europe do they come from? And so, being able to know that there's differentiation there too really makes, American society stronger. And so, the thing is for Asian American people, people think we all came from the one spot in Asia where, that largest continent. And so we have to have more of those stories told. So I think that's the only way to get around because what you describe, Anthony, is ignorance, and our communities have plenty of ignorance too that we have to, those who have some light to shed have that responsibility to do that.
Yeah, I think you said, earlier you said, nobody in Asia considers themselves Asian, right? It's not until we get here that that a lot of people realize we're all lumped up into this category. And so we have to decide what that means. Like, why did we adopt this term, this umbrella, inconveniently convenient term of Asian American, and then on top of that Pacific Islander as well? It's like, so what do we want that to mean? And I've said this a lot. It's like there was a moment where I became Asian American. I wasn't born this way. I became Asian American. And that was when I decided, like, this community, this large community, bigger than myself, that I affirm and I become a part of, like, this means something to me. What I want it to guide who I am in this world, and I want to sort of like use it as a way to sort of uplift this larger group and empower us. there is a battle for what what that community is, and the boundaries of that community, and we have to continuously, stretch and and educate and fight so that we don't close down these the doors of this community, because it's continually expanding, and even within the people we don't even know what it means, what I mean? So we have to educate ourselves and fight for those boundaries, to expand them. And it's like it's an education process, I think, even amongst ourselves.
I will say, though, to both of your points, it is interesting how nobody ever tells white people, go back to Caucasia, or how do you why can't you speak Caucasian? Or, it's like there is a sort of sense of, by creating common ground, we sometimes erase difference within ourselves. And maybe it's time for us to really focus in some ways on difference and not just common ground. Great question.
Come on, there must be more questions.
Well, I want to make sure that folks have time to get your autograph, get your books and T-shirts, and eat. But Josh has one question? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi. Is this on?
Oh, come on.
Okay. I'll just talk loud. My name is Joshua Brown. Oh, sure.
The light is on it. It should be on.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Joshua Brown. I'm a history student here, and one of the terms you mentioned, like missing in history, kind of resounded with me. And as an aspiring history professor, I was wondering some advice you could give to kind of eliminate these gaps that are missing in history.
So the people who declare what is legitimate history and what is not, or what is worthy history and what is not, they don't see the gaps. So it's just insisting on filling those gaps yourself. I mean, even among Chinese in China, there's this gap, about this. And so how do you get the story told? And how do you get, as a history professor, a focus on an area that has not yet been anointed or whatever? And it's just, or as a writer, or as any artist, or, see yourself as a truth teller. And don't let all of those voices that say, no, does anybody care about this? Well, who cares about ancient Greek languages? I mean, not to say they're not legit, but really, I mean, who says what is more important than another? And to just remember that the story that you carry in you and the history that you know is part of human history, and it deserves to be told, and not to let anybody stop you from doing that. Go for it.
Well, I want to really, with my heartfelt thanks to my dream team, dream panelist here, with they call us Bruce, with Phil, Jeff, and of course Helen. One small story about Helen Zia is she has a memory like you won't believe. I met her when I was a grad student on the floor at a conference and told her a little snippet about my mom. And 10 years later, she remembered everything. And it was just, she's so present when she engages with you. And who would have ever thought that right now, as a professor here at Cal Poly Pomona, that I would be able to really be in the same company, still Helen Zia.
The memory is leaving, though, I have to tell you.
No, but it's so heartfelt. And so I encourage all of you to take this moment to be present. Take advantage of the people who are here in front of you, because you too may say 10 years from now, I met them at Cal Poly Pomona and they still remember me, because those are the kind of people that we have on the panel today. So please give a heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists. And if you can humor me by all coming up here, Helen, Jeff, and Phil, if you can stand, I want everyone to stand in front of them, and I'm going to take a group picture.
What?